Okay, now as part of the launch, we're going to move on to a panel session. We have three panelists with us this evening. Associate Professor Wendy Steele, who is based in the Sustainability and Urban Planning Program and the Centre for Urban Research here at RMIT University. We have Andrew Hollers, who's the General Manager of Launch Housing, which is a major community housing organisation. And we also have Professor Brad Hooker from the University of Reading. So welcome and thank you for participating in the session tonight. Okay, I might start by asking Wendy a question to get the discussion going. So Wendy, obviously we're awash around the world in new types of city networks, new concepts for cities such as fast cities, slow cities, resilient cities, smart cities, wild cities. I think you may be familiar with that concept as well, Wendy. The ethical cities offers a new sort of adjective to describe cities. I wonder if you might be able to reflect on what contribution the notion of the ethical city can offer as an attribute or ambition for cities.
Yeah, thanks, Jago. Look, at the heart of this new book by Brendan, John and Ralph is the need to think deeply, not superficially, about the kinds of cities that we want. And this is important because, as David Harvey pointed out in his famous essay on the right to the city, and building on earlier work by Henri Lefebvre, the kinds of cities that we want cannot be divorced from the kind of people that we want to be. So the right to the ethical city, as these authors highlight, is about building bridges of hope, networks of care, and working in mutually respective ways with how they describe it as deep fearlessness and revolutionary pragmatism across the urban terrain. And in this sense, they're following Harvey, who said that Lefebvre was right to insist that the revolution has to be urban in its broadest sense of the term, or in fact nothing at all. So, I mean, we mostly live in cities, but we're situated in damaged and wounded country. And this is founded on the disjuncture and detached from moral accountability. So the path towards reconciliation and urban regeneration depends on recognising this ethical commitment and connection that exists between people and planet, between Indigenous and settler people in particular, mutual respect, care, responsibility and intention, and not just relying on some kind of hope, or as I'll mention in a second, smart or resilient cities to usher in a different kind of future. So the emphasis here is on situated understandings of context, of culture, of history, politics and power. We need to be present and bear witness to the entangled nature of the kind of damage that's been inflicted on vulnerable people and places. So this is a process of shared responsibility, the necessary action that we need to take together to live sustainably on the earth. And when I read about ethical cities, this is what I take out of it, that we need to approach our cities and ourselves as an ethical inquiry with, as Leonie Sandercock once said, a frame of mind much more humble, much more open and much more collaborative than that of the heroic modernist planner, although we might speak of modernity writ large. So an ethic of care has really surfaced as a rallying point for collective action in the Anthropocene. And feminist scholars Joan Tronto and Bernice Fisher, they talk about an ethic of care as everything we do to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we can all live in it as well as possible. And it's this sort of careful justice and this caring with ethic that I felt was woven through the book in the different ways that Brendan and his colleagues try and pick up on these themes. So how might our cities be different if an ethic of care for people, for other species and places, lay at the heart of cities in this climate of change? So compare ethical cities to the two current orthodoxies that frame and guide our cities, the resilient city and the smart city. So if the City of Melbourne is resilient, and this is a question, not a statement, it is critical to ask for whom, how, in what ways and to what effect. I mean, resilience can mean everything or nothing, depending on your perspective. It's a word that feels good, like freedom or flexibility. I mean, who wouldn't want to be resilient? But it can mean so many different things to different people. The concept was predicated on the ability to recover and adapt to crisis. And it can be progressive if it's about protecting threatened species or communities, but it can also valorise a static conception of community identity, which makes it actually, a very conservative process, very hard to transform or adapt in progressive ways. And similarly, let's think about the smart city. I mean, this lexicon has emerged in an attempt to chart the evolution of an era, framed by ICTs and resource-efficient technologies. And they structure the nature of our cities through infrastructure, economic activity, even our everyday life. We have smart people constituted in and through smart technologies, and yet, smart initiatives may favour affluent parts of the city. People are vulnerable within this smart city. Urban geographer Professor Colin McFarlane writes of a dysfunctional, struggling smart city that's splintered, unequal, congested, unable to deliver equitable, ethical cities and directed by contested urban imaginaries. All these raises questions that the book addresses about equity, about access, about distribution, about who benefits from the current normative vision of, the smart city and its networked infrastructures. So for most of us, home is in the city. We are an increasingly urban species. And if our cities are a reflection of us and a mirror to who we are now and who we want to be in the future, then it's refreshing, and I might argue, as Mike Berry did, necessary to switch to an emphasis on ethical cities, as Brendan, John and Ralph encourage us to do, which purposely puts values, principles, responsibility, commitment and care right to the front of the urban stage. And one only has to look at the news and the state of federal politics in Australia today to know that a focus on ethical cities is urgently needed, now more than ever. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Jago.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for that very broad-ranging overview. I'll move to Andrew now. Now, Andrew, as someone who's heavily involved in the community housing and social housing sector, wondering if you might offer some reflections on the key gaps in delivering universal, sustainable and affordable housing for everyone in cities, and how can the notion of ethical cities advance that cause?
Yeah, thanks, Jago, and welcome everyone, and congratulations to the authors for the book. I'd be lying if I've read it all, but I have dipped into it. So, look, I guess for me, it's when you mentioned the term right to the city, that for me also implies a right to housing. And that's, I think, a really fundamental principle that we need to adhere to. And I guess for the organisation I work for, Launch Housing, I guess the nuts and bolts of what an ethical city looks like really came to home in June, July last year. There's nothing like a global pandemic to really bring to the fore the reality of what an ethical city look like or not, who's on the pointy end of the stick, so who actually where's the disadvantages get compounded, and what are the governance or lack thereof of arrangements to address these issues. For those who don't know, our agency at the height of the pandemic in July housed 2,000 people in hotels. So we had 2,000 people who were either sleeping rough or experiencing some other forms of homelessness, who, because of the pandemic, came into sight of policymakers and who then decided as a public health measure to get everyone off the street and into hotels. Then all of a sudden, it became abundantly clear that, surprise, surprise, after 30 years of me working in this sector, you could actually solve rough sleeping pretty simply when you actually have the money and the will. And so COVID for us, I guess, highlighted the issue of what an ethical city ideally could look like, but also, I guess, what's the on-the-ground governance arrangements you need to achieve that. So to go to your question, Jago, I guess the whole issue around social and affordable housing has been a pressing one for far too long. And we know both in this state and Australia nationally, historical levels of underinvestment in both social and affordable housing. We're just playing catch up. And it's a real shame. And I guess to state the obvious, despite some good announcements from the state government here in Victoria, not to be sniffed at, be fair to say that the federal government has gone missing in action again. And that's of grave concern, is that at a national level, you actually do need to have a national housing strategy to supply social and affordable housing now and over the next 2 to 3 decades. So I guess for us as an agency, COVID has highlighted obviously the need for housing, that, the health of one person is intimately bound with the health of everyone else. And to actually address that, both in terms of physical and mental health, you actually need housing. In some ways it's a no-brainer, but it seems far to be a really politically a difficult task to manage. But I guess for us also, the governance element here, which I know is important to a notion of an ethical city, I think comes to the fore. And for me, and declare your self-interest, I'm tragic from the local government area in Victoria. Forms of local government, not just at a capital city level, but just other forms of municipal governance and local governance more broadly, I think, are now coming to the fore as a way of addressing this. And we are fortunate to see that basically on a municipal basis, you can actually work with local entities, local players, local communities to actually address things like rough sleeping and doing it in a really practical and manageable way. That for me is a great illustration of an ethical city in practice. Yes, it needs to have all the theory or the conceptual things around that, and I really love the book in achieving that. But there's also really some great examples being played out across Australia and sure in other countries where you can actually deliver on the notion of an ethical city. So to conclude from, I guess, my perspective and the perspective of the organisation that we live with, we've been long sort of lobbying, I suppose, to at least the city of Melbourne about, hey, come on, you can't sort of tout yourself as a livable city when you've got rough sleeping. It just cannot be the case. You cannot have a case where you can tout yourself be a livable city or a smart city or a resilient city, where, as we shown last year, you actually had 2,000 of your citizens, albeit gross overrepresentation, at least about 20% of those who identify as Indigenous, as being experiencing some form of homelessness and trauma in a really sort of severe way. So I guess to conclude, an ethical city for us is a real issue. It's a really neat way of framing the politics of this. It does bring to the fore, as I said, not just the right to the city, but the right to housing, as that is a fundamental principle. And that it does also, I guess, spotlight the importance of the different arrangements, governance arrangements, where you can actually achieve that. And my hunch is that into the future, the role of municipal governments, not all, but the role of municipal councils generally will become far more important in this space as well, because they can't wait. They can't wait to see and get action, certainly from the federal government, on issues of climate change, race and the like. Homelessness, likewise, and affordable housing will be issues, I believe, that local councils and others will want to address, mainly for the lack of action at a more national level. So look, in summary, ethical city idea, I think, is a wonderful way of framing and bringing forth these issues into the public domain.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's really great to have that housing perspective in the conversation, and kind of the fundamental feature of the ethical city is affordable and well-designed housing. I'd like to welcome Professor Brad Hooker from the University of Reading, from part of the university that's called Ethical Reading, which I'm not familiar with, but I look forward to hearing something about that in Brad's presentation. And I'm going to prompt you with a question, Brad. Why is intent and action on ethical cities needed, and how can it be achieved? How can we turn ethical cities from a concept into practice?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'll be brief, but I'll start off by making a sort of explanation of what ethical reading is. Ethical reading is not actually connected to the university. I'm involved in ethical reading and worked at the university for a long time, and some of the other people who are involved in ethical reading come from the university, especially from the philosophy department at the university. But they really, in some sense, they happen to be in the same town. So Ethical Reading is a nonprofit community interest corporation. Community interest company is the technical name, which was founded by people who retired early, having done well in software and wanted to improve the city in which they lived. And I'll come back and say a few more things about ethical reading in a moment, but let me first turn to the book, which I very much enjoyed. And the first thing to do is for me anyway, is to say that the book's main theme is that ethical cities need to do a number of different things, one of which is reduce poverty and inequality, another which is to increase good governance, democracy, and social inclusion, and the third is to address the climate crisis. Now, Brendan, Ralph, and John add respect for human rights, enhancing resilience, and improving quality of life as other characteristics of ethically oriented cities. But I think it's fair to say that reducing poverty and inequality, increasing good governance, and addressing the climate crisis are the sort of three main outcome aims. Now, they also have a process aim, and the process aim is to have the city be governed in a way that's transparent and accountable, and have an engaged population in the city, including, I was going to say all stakeholders, but that just means everyone, having an engaged population, ultimately making the decisions about their city. Now, there's naturally some tension here between the specificity of the outcomes identified, reducing poverty and inequality, increasing good governance, and addressing the climate crisis on the one hand, and the process aim of open-ended democratic process on the other. And the book is open about that tension. I mean, why? Well, because there's a danger, of course, that democracy can get hijacked by lies, scapegoating, intimidation, playing on people's fear of outsider, on people's fears of economic competition, on people's fear of losing their rank in the socioeconomic order, etc. In order for democracies to have a good chance of choosing good rulers and good policies, there has to be a free and conscientious press to find and impartially report the facts. There also need to be the rule of law so that those who win the elections can't slant the army, police, courts, tax authorities, etc., against rival politicians and dissenters. Although humans are capable of wonderful acts, humans are also prone to trying to rig and exploit systems and situations to the advantage of themselves, their circle, their supporters. In order to prevent the democratic system from being manipulated and ultimately undermined, a free and conscientious press and a separation between the government and the legal system have proven to be essential, necessary conditions. Even then, there's no guarantee that the democratic decisions will have good outcomes. Actually, let me just add, I should have said, well, of course, now it's not the sort of free press, and the discussion of the free press and the discussion of the social media go hand in hand. I certainly agree with Brendan, Ralph, and John about the outcomes that would be good. Like many others, I believe that we now find ourselves in a time when the chief threat to the very existence of the world is actually climate change. Thus, unless the highest priority now, in my view, thus the highest priority now, in my view, should be for cities to be redeveloped so as to reduce their carbon output to net zero. And this won't happen without masses of us campaigning for minimizing climate change to be the top of the agenda in city planning. Now, Ethical Reading, as I mentioned before, the nonprofit that I'm here representing today, has improved sustainability in Reading and the surrounding area has improving sustainability in Reading and the surrounding area as one of our main programs, one of our main points of activity. But we have other programs as well. A program to get organizers to commit to a code of ethics, a program to get organizations to be more ethical in their recruitment of staff, which is a big problem in Reading, a program to help organizations do more for mental well-being of their staff, and a program of increasing awareness of ethics in the city and its schools, with meetings of various kinds, social media events, and liaisons with schools. Ethical Reading's idea is that if our city can earn a reputation as a city where people are willing to help each other, a city where honesty is prized, a city where business and nonprofit organizations have a strong ethical consciousness, including on sustainability, then our city will be a nicer place to live and work, and people and companies will be attracted to move here and then stay, which will increase the economic prosperity of the area. So I think that conclusion coheres with Wendy's remarks about care and concern, mutual care and concern being a core idea, at least of Ethical Reading's project. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.